Mason Reed knew the night had officially gone sideways when his flight disappeared from the board instead of changing gates. 1 second, Austin was listed beneath a red delayed notice. The next, the line was gone. Around him, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport filled with the collective groan of several hundred people receiving the same bad news in different directions. Thunder rolled beyond the terminal windows, and rain blurred the runway lights into streaks of white and amber. Mason checked his airline app. Cancelled. He checked the hotel app. Nothing nearby under $300, and the few available rooms vanished while he was looking at them. Perfect, he muttered. He had spent 3 days in Nashville mixing audio for a corporate event where executives had complained about microphone levels while standing 6 inches away from the speakers. All he wanted was his apartment, his own shower, and 8 uninterrupted hours without anyone asking whether he could make something louder. Instead, sometime after midnight, he found an almost empty gate at the far end of the terminal and claimed a seat beside an outlet. His phone was at 12%. His laptop was worse. He plugged both in, set his equipment bag between his shoes, and pulled a cheap pair of backup wired earbuds from the front pocket. The left side worked. The right side gave him 3 seconds of music, crackled, then died. Mason twisted the cable. Nothing. Technical emergency, a voice asked nearby. Mason looked over. The man sitting 2 seats away appeared to be around his age, wearing a dark jacket over a sweater and holding a paper cup that had probably contained airport coffee several hours ago. He had been reading something on his phone, but was now watching Mason wrestle with the cable. Mason held up the earbuds. National tragedy. The stranger smiled. Should we alert somebody? They have enough problems. Another announcement echoed overhead, followed by a list of canceled departures. The man checked his phone. Apparently Santa Fe has rejected me for the evening. Austin did the same to me. That feels personal. Mason gave a tired laugh and returned to the earbuds. He could probably splice the cable if he had his small electronics kit. But that was at home because normal people did not travel expecting to repair headphones at 1 in the morning. Danny, the stranger said after a moment. Mason, that might have been the end of it. Mason was good at making the end of things easy. He could sleep sitting upright, wake before boarding, find coffee, and get himself home without involving anyone else. His mother used to call him low maintenance. Mason had always taken it as a compliment. He opened the packet of vending machine almonds he had bought near security. Danny looked over. Please tell me that is not dinner. It is food. That is a legal distinction, not a nutritional one. Mason ate an almond. You have something better? Danny looked down the concourse. Metal gates were already lowered across most restaurants. Maybe. He stood, slung his carry-on over one shoulder, and picked up his empty cup. I saw a place near the other terminal that looked like it was still serving something. Mason nodded. Good luck. Danny took a few steps, then stopped and turned back. I'm going to see what is still open. Want some company? The answer rose automatically in Mason's throat. No thanks. I am good. He had said versions of it thousands of times, usually before checking whether he was actually good. Mason looked at the dead earbud in his hand, the almonds in his lap, and the storm moving across the dark windows. Then he looked at Danny. Sure. Danny smiled. Great. But if all we find is another vending machine, I am not calling almonds dinner. Mason unplugged his phone, packed the broken earbuds, and stood. You are very controlling for someone I met 30 seconds ago. And yet you are following me. Mason picked up his equipment bag. Temporary lapse in judgment. They started down the quieting concourse together, with no idea yet whether they were looking for food, killing time, or simply making a long night feel a little less empty. The search for food took them farther than Mason expected, mostly because Danny refused to accept the first 2 vending machines as legitimate options. There are crackers, Mason said as they passed the second one. You already tried to make almonds a meal. You have lost voting privileges. That seems unconstitutional. Airport law. They finally found a counter near another terminal where one exhausted employee was still selling breakfast tacos. Danny looked at the menu, then at the clock on his phone. It is 1:30 in the morning. And can something still be breakfast if nobody has gone to bed yet? Mason accepted 2 foil-wrapped tacos from the employee. You are asking the wrong person. I work concerts. Breakfast is whenever the venue stops smelling like beer. Danny laughed and carried their drinks toward an empty seating area. They had barely sat down when an older man nearby stood, turned in a slow circle and stared at the overhead signs with growing concern. "Excuse me," he said. "Do either of you know where gate C31 is?" Mason looked toward the sign above them. "Other direction." The man frowned at his phone. "This says my new flight is from C31, but the message says I should take the Skylink to Terminal C. I thought I was already in C." Danny stood. "Can I see the message?" "Please." The man held out his phone. Danny read it without taking it from his hand. "They moved you from Terminal A. You are in D right now." Mason listened as another boarding announcement echoed through the concourse. "And if you follow that sign," he added, pointing, "you will end up going the long way around. Skylink entrance is behind us." The man looked relieved. "I am Walter. I have been awake since 5 yesterday morning, and I think airports should stop using letters after midnight." "Reasonable policy," Danny said. They walked Walter to the escalator and waited until he recognized the correct platform sign. On the way back, Danny glanced at Mason. "You heard his gate announcement? The speakers over here are delayed by maybe half a second from the main system." Danny stared at him. "You noticed that?" "Sound engineer." "Right." He pointed toward a nearby elevator as its doors opened with a dull chime. "How does that sound?" Mason gave him a flat look. "Like an elevator." "That bad?" "I already regret telling you what I do." Back at their seats, they finished the tacos while the storm continued beyond the windows. Eventually, they wandered toward a quieter section overlooking the runway, where lightning flashed behind heavy clouds without much thunder reaching through the glass. Danny stretched out in one chair, while Mason took the next. "So what exactly does a museum exhibit designer do?" Mason asked. "Mostly convince people that objects should tell stories instead of sitting in glass boxes with paragraphs nobody reads." "That sounds suspiciously like you have opinions." "Many. Dangerous." Danny nodded toward Mason's equipment bag. "And you make musicians sound better than they actually do?" "I make sure everyone can hear exactly how good or bad they already are." "Cruel profession." Mason pulled out his broken earbuds again and tried bending the cable near the plug. Music returned briefly, then vanished from the right side. Danny held out his hand. "Give me the dead one." "Why?" "Scientific research." Mason handed it over. Danny placed the useless earbud in his ear. Mason put the working one in his own. "Congratulations. You are listening to silence." "Very minimalist." Mason laughed, then took out the working side and offered it across. Danny listened for several seconds before handing it back. They passed the single functioning earbud between them while Mason played a song from his phone, each hearing fragments the other had just heard. It should have been inconvenient. Somehow it was not. By the time the song ended, the terminal had gone almost completely quiet. Danny rested the dead earbud against his knee and looked through the rain-streaked glass. "Not bad for a national tragedy." Mason smiled and took the cable back, realizing that for the first time all night, he had stopped checking how many hours remained until morning. By 6:15, the storm had weakened to a steady rain, and the terminal began waking around them. Coffee machines hissed behind reopening counters. Cleaning crews disappeared as travelers returned to the gates. Mason checked his phone and found a new boarding pass to Austin. Danny was studying his own screen. "Santa Fe?" Mason asked. 8:40. "Mine is 8:25. Danny glanced up at the overhead signs. "Of course they are sending us in opposite directions." Mason looked at the terminal map. "Apparently airport law has spoken. I knew that was a real thing." They found coffee and stood near the Skylink entrance while people hurried around them with fresh boarding passes and tired children. The night suddenly felt temporary in a way it had not an hour earlier. Danny took a sip, made a face, and stared into the cup. "How does this sound?" Mason blinked. "Coffee does not sound." "You are avoiding the question. It sounds overpriced." "Excellent. Your professional expertise continues to amaze me." Mason smiled into his own cup. Their trains would arrive on opposite sides of the platform. A recorded announcement reminded passengers to keep their belongings with them. Danny glanced at Mason's equipment bag. "What song was that, by the way?" "What song?" "The one we listened to with your highly advanced single-channel audio system." Mason pulled out his phone. "You liked it?" "I heard approximately 40% of it, so I am reserving judgment." Mason found the track and sent it. Danny's phone buzzed almost immediately. He looked at the screen, then at Mason. "Now I have your number." That is generally how texting works. "Very trusting. You helped me find tacos. You passed the background check." The Skylink approached with a rising mechanical hum. Danny looked down at the broken earbuds hanging from Mason's hand. Can I have those? Mason frowned. The broken earbuds? Yes. Why? Souvenir. From what? Sleep deprivation. Maybe I want physical evidence that a professional sound engineer travels with terrible backup equipment. Mason held them out. No refunds. Danny took them and tucked them carefully into his carry-on. The train doors opened. For 1 second, Mason had the strange urge to say something that would make the night feel less accidental. But he could not think of anything that did not sound heavier than it needed to. Danny solved the problem by stepping backward toward his train. Safe flight, Mason. You too. Try not to critique the cabin speakers. No promises. Danny smiled as the doors closed between them. Mason watched the train pull away, then caught the next one toward his own gate. A week later, the airport had become one of those stories he occasionally remembered while working. He had not heard from Danny beyond a brief message confirming he made it home, and Mason had not pushed. On Thursday afternoon, he returned to his Austin apartment after a sound check and found a small padded envelope outside his door. The return address was Santa Fe. Mason carried it inside, opened it with his keys, and pulled out the earbuds. Beige conservation tape had been wrapped with absurd care around the damaged section of cable. A small note fell onto the counter. Museum-grade restoration. Probably. Mason laughed before he could stop himself. He plugged the earbuds into his laptop. Left channel. Clear. Right channel. Clear. Both worked. He stared at them for a moment, then picked up his phone. I regret to inform you, he typed, that your restoration passed audio inspection. Danny replied 2 minutes later. How does it sound? Mason leaned against the kitchen counter, smiling at the screen. He could have answered with one word. Instead, he pressed the voice message button. The voice message lasted 43 seconds, which was 38 seconds longer than Mason intended. By the end of the week, that became normal. Danny sent recordings during his walk from the museum to his car, usually beginning with some object he had spent the day trying to make interesting. Today I designed a display around a 19th century accounting ledger, he said one afternoon. I have officially reached the glamorous peak of museum work. Mason listened while wrapping cables backstage at an Austin club. Did you succeed? I made taxes emotionally compelling. Terrifying skill. In return, Mason sent Danny pieces of venues before the audience arrived. The low hum of an empty room, a drummer testing a snare, the first guitar chord bouncing off concrete walls. Danny started requesting reviews of increasingly inappropriate sounds. He sent an elevator chime from his apartment building. How does it sound? Like somebody lost a fight with a synthesizer. A grocery store freezer earned, aggressively refrigerated. A hotel ice machine received 3 silent seconds followed by, I am blocking your number. Danny replied, You say that, but here you are. Mason noticed the truth of it. He was there. He also noticed that Danny had learned his schedule without making a point of it. On show nights, messages stopped around 4 in the afternoon and resumed after 11. One Friday, Mason was halfway through troubleshooting a monitor problem when his phone buzzed. Eat before soundcheck. He ignored it. 20 minutes later came another message containing the address of a taco place across the street. Mason stared at the screen until Priya, the venue booking manager, looked over his shoulder. Are you being supervised? Apparently. Good. You forget food when speakers misbehave. Mason went for tacos. A few days later, Danny mentioned a presentation he had to give to museum leadership about a proposed exhibit layout. His voice sounded casual, but Mason heard him restart the same sentence twice. The morning of the presentation, Danny found an audio file waiting on his phone. It was 30 seconds of an empty Austin venue before doors opened. Quiet room tone, distant guitar tuning, somebody laughing backstage. Mason had labeled it, before everyone starts pretending they are not nervous. Danny listened twice. He did not tell Mason that until later. Instead, he sent, presentation survived. Accounting ledger remains glamorous. Their exchanges stayed easy, but small details accumulated. Mason learned Danny preferred diner coffee to expensive coffee and always read exhibit labels even when he disliked them. Danny learned Mason carried spare batteries for everyone except himself and could identify a badly grounded cable by sound before anyone else noticed the problem. Then, one Tuesday evening, Danny called instead of sending a voice note. I am coming to Austin next month. Mason stopped coiling a cable. For what? Museum design conference. 3 days. My registration was approved this morning. Mason leaned against the soundboard. So this is professional. Very. There will be name tags. Serious. Business. Possibly tote bags. Mason smiled. What are you doing after the sessions? There was a brief pause. Nothing yet. Mason looked across the empty venue, suddenly aware that he had asked before giving himself time to decide whether asking was sensible. I could show you Austin when you are done. Danny's answer came warm but unhurried. I would like that. Good. Should I be worried about your tour? Only if you insult the acoustics. I would never. You absolutely would. After they hung up, Mason returned to his cables, but his attention kept drifting toward the repaired earbuds lying beside the soundboard. Until now, everything between them had existed safely inside phones, airports, and 1,000 miles of distance. In a few weeks, Danny would be standing inside Mason's actual life, and Mason found himself wondering which parts of it he was already hoping Danny would notice. Danny's first night in Austin ended at the back of a crowded music venue, where Mason seemed to become a different person without changing anything about himself. He stood behind the soundboard in a dark shirt with headphones resting around his neck, one hand adjusting a control while his eyes moved constantly between the stage, the meters, and the room. A guitarist signaled something from beneath the lights. Mason answered with 2 fingers, made a small adjustment, and the next chord suddenly filled the venue without swallowing the singer's voice. Danny watched from beside Priya, who glanced at him and said, "He hears everything. I am beginning to understand that." After the show, Mason found Danny near the bar. How did it sound? Danny stared at him. You cannot use my question against me. I just did. Annoyingly good. Mason smiled, visibly pleased despite trying not to show it. The next afternoon, Danny returned the favor by taking Mason through a small gallery hosting one of the conference events. A group had gathered around a temporary exhibition model, and Danny slipped naturally into explaining why an ordinary object needed space, light, and context before people understood why it mattered. Mason stood at the edge of the group, watching him transform from the playful man who sent recordings of grocery store freezers into someone precise and quietly passionate. Later, outside, Mason said, "You are different when you talk about exhibits." Danny glanced at him. Bad different? No. You stop wondering whether people are interested. Danny looked surprised by the observation, then smiled. Maybe they have name tags. It gives me confidence. That evening they walked without much of a plan, eventually following the sound of a street guitarist playing near a busy pedestrian area. Danny stopped. Wait. He reached into his jacket and produced the repaired earbuds, beige conservation tape still wrapped around the cable. Mason laughed. You brought those to Texas? Museum artifacts require responsible stewardship. Danny handed him one side and put the other in his own ear. Mason connected them to his phone and played a recording from the previous night's show. It was ridiculous. The street guitarist kept bleeding through the earbuds, creating an accidental second soundtrack. Danny started laughing. Your mix has a new guitarist. He is rushing the tempo. Of course that is what bothers you. They stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing the repaired earbuds until Mason realized their arms had been touching for nearly a minute. Neither moved. Later, they ended up on a quieter pedestrian bridge, city lights scattered beyond the railing. Danny rested his forearms against it while Mason stood beside him. For once, there was no airport announcement, no conference session, no show waiting to start. Danny looked down at the street below. Can I say something slightly embarrassing? I reserve the right to make fun of you. Fair. Danny turned toward him. I think I was hoping the airport was not the only reason we worked. Mason's first instinct was to answer with humor. It was the easiest way to keep a moment from asking too much of him. But Danny was not asking Mason to promise anything. He was simply standing there, letting Mason know the night at Dallas had mattered. Mason looked at Danny's hand resting between them on the railing. Then he placed his own over it. Danny's expression softened. That is surprisingly clear. Communication for you. Do not ruin it. Danny smiled. Mason moved closer slowly enough that either of them could step away. Neither did. Their first kiss was brief, warm, and almost cautious, followed by a quiet laugh when the repaired earbuds, still hanging between them, caught against Mason's jacket. Very romantic, Danny said. Museum-grade romance. Probably. Mason laughed, But when they started walking again, he kept Danny's hand in his. The airport had given them a reason to talk. Distance had given them room to keep things easy. Austin had removed both excuses. For the first time, Mason understood that he was not wondering whether he liked having Danny around. He was wondering what it would mean to make room for him when ordinary life stopped being this convenient. For the next 2 weeks, Mason and Danny stopped treating their calls like something accidental. They did not define much beyond the obvious fact that they wanted to keep seeing each other, but that alone changed the rhythm. Mason called after shows even when it was late. Danny sent photographs from the museum without inventing reasons for them. They compared calendars and found one weekend that might work before both schedules became crowded again. Then Priya asked Mason to meet her at the venue on a Monday afternoon. She was waiting beside the empty stage with 2 coffees and an expression that made him suspicious. "You are either firing me or asking me to fix something." "Neither." She handed him a cup. Management approved the production manager position. Mason went still. He had spent years moving between freelance gigs, carrying equipment from venue to venue, saying yes to unpredictable hours because that was how he built a reputation. This job meant stability, authority, and the chance to shape how an entire room operated. "They want me. They want you." Priya smiled. "Full time." The catch came with the schedule. The venue was expanding its programming, and the first 6 months would mean long nights, most weekends, new staff training, and very little flexibility. Mason looked across the empty room toward the soundboard. He still wanted it. That was what made the timing complicated. He called Danny that evening. "You got it," Danny said as soon as Mason explained. "Not officially. They offered it." "Mason, that is huge. It is going to be a lot. You have wanted something like this for years." Mason leaned against his kitchen counter. "Yeah." Danny's happiness sounded completely genuine, so Mason matched it instead of mentioning the calendar open on his laptop. "I think I am going to take it." "I think you should." 3 days later, Danny called from an empty museum gallery in Santa Fe. His voice had the strange, careful energy Mason had learned meant he was excited and trying not to sound too excited. "Lena pulled me into her office today." "Good or bad?" "She offered me lead designer on the permanent regional history exhibition." Mason straightened. Danny had talked about that exhibition before. It was the kind of project visitors might walk through for years. "That is your project?" "It could be." "No, that is your project." Danny laughed softly. "Installation is going to destroy my schedule." "Still worth it?" "I think so." "Then do it." Neither man said Santa Fe. Neither needed to. Over the next several days, the calendars began explaining what they would not. Mason's new position filled evenings and weekends with staffing meetings, technical rehearsals, and shows. Danny's exhibition schedule filled with design reviews, artifact planning, contractor meetings, and an installation period that could not simply move because he wanted a free Saturday. Their messages stayed warm. Their calls still ended reluctantly. But increasingly, conversations sounded like logistics. "I might have Sunday afternoon. I have a lender meeting Monday morning. Maybe the following weekend. Whatever works for you." Danny said that often. Mason always answered, "We will figure it out." Both phrases were meant to be reassuring. Neither actually required them to say what they were afraid of losing. One night, Mason listened to a voice note from Danny while standing alone behind the soundboard after everyone else had left. Danny was describing a display case problem, then casually mentioned that the next 3 weekends were probably gone. Mason typed, "No problem. We will figure it out." He stared at the message before sending it. The repaired earbuds lay beside his hand, beige tape wrapped around the cable like evidence that some things could be made functional with an improvised fix. Mason sent the message anyway. A moment later, 3 dots appeared. "Whatever works for you," Danny replied. Mason read the words twice. Nothing about them was wrong. That was exactly what bothered him. Danny arrived in Austin on a Friday afternoon carrying one small suitcase and the repaired earbuds in his jacket pocket. Mason had warned him that the weekend would be bad. 3 shows, 2 new technicians, and a production schedule that seemed to change every hour. Danny had said he understood. By 9 that night, he understood differently. Mason moved constantly between the soundboard, backstage, and the loading area, answering questions before anyone finished asking them. When Danny appeared beside him with a paper bag from a nearby restaurant, Mason blinked as if he had forgotten dinner existed. "You did not have to do that." "I know." Danny handed him the bag. "Chicken sandwich. No almonds." Mason smiled despite himself. Airport law. Permanent statute. The next day was worse. Danny found Mason kneeling behind an equipment rack, tracing a cable problem while two crew members waited nearby. Rather than interrupt, Danny set coffee on a safe corner of the console and began organizing the loose cables Mason had already labeled. Later he picked up dinner. He waited through soundcheck. He waited through the show. Near midnight, Mason finally found him sitting alone in the back row of the emptying venue, answering museum emails on his phone. Gratitude hit Mason first, then guilt. Danny had flown from Santa Fe and spent most of the day making Mason's impossible schedule easier. "You do not have to keep doing things for me," Mason said. Danny looked up. "I know. I mean it. You came here to visit, not bring me food and organize cables. I was trying to help. I know, but I can handle this." Danny's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Okay." The next morning, Danny stopped helping. He did not bring coffee. He did not ask whether Mason had eaten. He sat where Mason had told him he could watch soundcheck and kept himself occupied. It should have relieved Mason. Instead, every time he looked over, the space between them felt strangely formal. After the final show, they walked toward Mason's car beneath the cool Austin night. Danny was leaving for Santa Fe the next morning. Mason unlocked the trunk and put Danny's suitcase inside. "You have been quiet." Danny gave a small shrug. "You said you could handle things. That does not mean you have to sit there like a stranger." Danny looked at him then. There was no anger in his face, which somehow made Mason listen more carefully. "Sometimes I cannot tell whether you want me here, or you just do not know how to tell me to leave." Mason stared at him. "Why would I fly you out here if I wanted you to leave? You did not fly me anywhere. I came." Danny paused. "And that is kind of the problem." Mason frowned. Danny looked down at the pavement. "I keep showing up with food, fixing things, making myself useful. Then I wait for that to prove I belong somewhere." His mouth tightened briefly. "That is not your fault." Mason thought about every time he had said he was fine, every offer he had waved away before considering whether he wanted it. "I do want you here," he said, but even to him the words sounded late. Danny nodded. "I believe you. I just wish I did not have to guess." Neither of them tried to force the conversation into a solution. The next morning, Mason drove Danny to the airport. Their goodbye was warm but subdued, unfinished rather than final. That night, back in Santa Fe, Danny opened his laptop to prepare for the most important museum presentation of his career and caught himself waiting for Mason to remember it. In Austin, Mason returned to the venue and found the beige-taped earbuds beside the soundboard where Danny had left them after listening to a mix. He picked them up and understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that he had spent years making sure nobody ever had to carry him. Somewhere along the way, he had also made it difficult for anyone to know when he wanted them beside him. The earbuds worked perfectly. Mason stood alone in the empty venue, one in each ear, and for once that did not feel like proof that everything was fine. Danny stared at the presentation slides for another 10 minutes before realizing he was doing exactly what he had always done. He was waiting for Mason to remember tomorrow mattered, waiting for a message that would prove Danny mattered without forcing him to ask for one. He closed the laptop, picked up his phone, and called. Mason answered over the muffled sound of equipment being moved. "Hey, everything okay?" Danny almost said yes automatically. Instead, he stood and walked toward his apartment window. "I have the exhibition presentation tomorrow morning." There was a brief pause. "Right? 9:30. Danny had not expected the fact that Mason remembered to make the next sentence harder. "Yeah." He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his phone. "I want you to wish me luck before I go in." Mason went quiet. Danny continued before he could soften it into a joke. "Not because I need help. I just want to hear from you." In Austin, Mason stopped beside the soundboard. The beige-taped earbuds were lying near his laptop. A few months earlier, he might have answered with humor because humor made requests feel smaller. This time he simply said, "I will call before you go in." Danny exhaled. "Okay, 8:50 your time." "That works." Then 8:50. The next morning, Mason called at exactly 8:50. He did not offer presentation advice. He did not tell Danny not to be nervous. He listened while Danny complained that one slide suddenly looked terrible even though it had looked fine the night before. Then he said, "You know this exhibit better than anyone in that room. Good luck." Danny smiled. "Thank you. Call me when you are done." "I will." The presentation went well. Not perfectly, which Danny almost preferred. Lena challenged one design choice. Another curator asked for revisions to the visitor flow, and Danny defended the parts that mattered instead of automatically agreeing to everything. When he walked out, his first message to Mason was not a report. It was simply, "I think I did good." Mason replied, "I knew you would." 3 days later, Mason finished a brutal Saturday show and found Priya in the production office reviewing the next week's schedule. "You have comp time," she said without looking up. "Take next Sunday." Mason shook his head. "We have the new lighting crew, which I can cover. The monitor rack has been acting weird." Priya finally looked at him. "Mason, go home occasionally. The building will survive." His instinct was immediate. Stay. Check everything himself. Make sure nobody had to compensate for his absence. Then he remembered Danny sitting alone in the back row because Mason had been too busy proving he could handle everything. "Sunday and Monday?" Mason asked. Priya raised an eyebrow. "Look at you negotiating. Can you cover it?" "Yes." Mason nodded slowly. "Then I am taking both." Outside the venue, he called Danny before he could reconsider. "I have 2 days next weekend." "Congratulations. Can I come to Santa Fe?" Silence. Mason felt his stomach tighten. Then Danny asked, "Do you have work here?" "No conference." "No audio emergency?" Mason smiled. "No." Danny's voice softened. "Then why are you coming?" Mason leaned against the brick wall outside the venue. Part of him still wanted to make the answer practical. Instead, he gave Danny the only reason that mattered. "I want to see you." Danny was quiet for half a second. "Then come." After they hung up, Mason looked through the venue window at the soundboard waiting inside. For once, leaving work in someone else's hands did not feel irresponsible. In Santa Fe, Danny added Mason's visit to his calendar without planning meals, errands, or anything useful he could do for him. There was nothing to earn. Next weekend, neither a storm nor a conference nor a problem to solve would put them in the same place. They were going to have to choose it themselves. Several weeks later, Mason arrived in Santa Fe on a Friday evening with one carry-on, the beige-taped earbuds in his jacket pocket, and no equipment bag. Danny noticed immediately. "You traveled without enough cables to operate a small television station. Personal growth. I am documenting this." Their careers had not become easier. Mason was still learning how to run an entire production department while training new technicians and surviving packed weekend schedules. Danny's permanent exhibition had entered installation, which meant contractors, artifact cases, lighting adjustments, and at least 3 daily problems nobody had predicted on paper. They had stopped pretending distance could be solved by enthusiasm. Instead, they had made something less dramatic and more useful. One protected weekend together each month, shorter visits when schedules allowed, and permission to ask for time without apologizing for wanting it. On Saturday evening, after the museum closed, Danny led Mason through the nearly finished exhibition. He did not ask Mason to fix anything. He did not explain why bringing him there was useful. He simply wanted Mason to see it. "This section changed after the presentation," Danny said, walking backward through a gallery. "Lena was right about the visitor flow, which I deeply resent." Mason stopped beside a display case containing everyday objects arranged beneath warm, focused light. "You made people look at ordinary things like they matter." Danny glanced at him. "That is the job. You are good at it." Danny smiled, accepting the compliment without turning it into a joke or offering something in return. Outside, evening had settled over Santa Fe, cool and clear. They bought coffee and sat in a quiet plaza while people crossed between adobe buildings beneath strings of warm lights. Danny reached into his coat pocket. "I brought something." He produced the old earbuds. Mason stared. "Those belong in a museum now." "I know a guy." Danny plugged them into his phone and handed one side to Mason. Music played for 3 seconds. Then Danny's earbud went silent. He tapped it twice. Nothing. Mason laughed. "Your museum-grade restoration has failed inspection. Temporary conservation issue." That is a creative way to say broken. Danny held the damaged cable toward him. Months ago, Mason would already have been bending it between his fingers, searching for the exact point of failure. Instead, he reached into his carry-on beside the bench and pulled out a small box. Danny narrowed his eyes. "What is that?" "Preventive maintenance." Inside was a new pair of wired earbuds. Mason opened them and handed one to Danny, keeping the other. Danny looked at the old beige-taped pair in his palm. "Retiring the museum restoration?" Mason took them gently and slipped them into the empty box. Archiving it. Danny laughed. They sat close enough for their shoulders to touch while the new earbuds divided the same song evenly between them. Mason's phone buzzed once with a venue message. He glanced at the screen, saw Priya's name, and put the phone face down. Nothing was wrong. She could handle it. Danny's calendar reminder appeared next, warning him about an early contractor meeting Monday morning. He dismissed it without apologizing for having work. Tomorrow Mason would fly back to Austin. Danny would stay in Santa Fe and finish the exhibition he had fought to lead. Neither had surrendered the life he was building. They had simply stopped treating closeness as something that had to happen around those lives instead of inside them. Danny leaned slightly closer as the song changed. How does it sound? Mason could have talked about the recording, the balance, or the cheap earbuds. Instead, he looked at Danny. Good.